say how many people might be doing crimes like you were doing?
It would be a guess, but it's not. It's far more than 35. It isn't that impossible in this society. It happens.
You were able to appear like an ordinary person, non-threatening to...
I lived as an ordinary person most of my life, even though I was living a parallel and increasingly sick life, other life. One victim let me back in the car. I locked myself out. She opened the door for me. My gun was under the seat. What in the hell am I doing telling you that? Am I a masochist? Am I looking to be tormented further? I'm trying to show you just how awful this got, how commanding these rages got. I was raging inside. There was just incredible energies, positive and negative, depending on a mood. That would trigger one or the other. And outside, I looked troubled at times. Other times I looked moody. Other times perfectly serene. Not very sane.
All right, joining me in the garage, I have Dr. Scott Bonn. We're going to be talking about serial killers here today. Doctor, could you introduce yourself to our beautiful listeners? Let them know where you are, what kind of doctor are you, and how you got interested in this field.
Sure thing. Well, yes, I am Dr. Scott Bonn. I am based in Las Vegas, Nevada, although I spent most of my life living and working in New York City. My PhD is in criminology, and I also have a background, interestingly, in media and communications. So I do study crime generally, but specifically serial killers, and I look at their motivations, what drives them, the hungers, the insatiable pathologies they have that lead them to kill. But I'm also extremely interested, because of my media background, in why we are so fascinated by them. And I mean the public and true crime fans, etc.
Well, that's a good question. Why do you think that we are? I mean, of course, it's only a certain percentage of our population. I know, I've been living in the true crime world with True Crime Garage for 8 or so years, and my book, The Delphi Murders. But I have friends in my social circles that are like, yeah, don't talk to me about any of that stuff. I want to stay as far away from it as possible. But for the people that are interested in this kind of stuff, why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, it is definitely a growing genre, with all the podcasts and television networks like HLN, Discovery, Investigation Discovery, Oxygen, it definitely is growing. But you're right, not everyone is interested in this stuff, but there are those who are not only interested, but, downright even obsessed with it. And I think that there's like most things in life, when you really bore down and take a look at it, it's more complicated than you might think on the surface. And I think that when it comes to the fascination with true crime, that's also true, because at one level, it's adrenaline pumping entertainment. Whether you're watching a Ted Bundy documentary or listening to a podcast, there's that adrenaline rush that goes along with it. And even as kids, we're attracted to haunted houses and monster movies and things like that. And I've maintained that true crime and serial killers in particular are for many adults what those things like fun houses and haunted houses are for kids, and that is adrenaline pumping entertainment. But there's a lot more to it than that, of course, and some of it has to do with the incomprehensible nature of what individuals, where we're talking serial killers here, like a Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer or John Wayne Gacy, did to their victims. Complete strangers, people that they didn't even know, and did these absolutely horrible, heinous acts of abduction and torture, and in some cases even, beyond killing, dismemberment, and Dahmer even ate some of his victims. And for most of us, that is just so incomprehensible that we're drawn to it to understand it, because psychologically, I believe many of us just don't like ambiguity. We don't like not understanding. And I think that there's this underlying psychological need to understand. And if we can somehow just wrap our minds around it, then maybe it's not so terrifying after all. I go around the country doing public speaking, performing actually a one-man theatrical event, Serial Killers with Dr. Scott Bonn. And what I find is that my audience, almost across the board, is between 80 and 90% female. And this is true of the true crime audience in general. It's definitely a female skewing audience in my experience. And women in particular, when it comes to true crime and even serial killers, I believe there's an empathy factor. They empathize with both the victims, certainly, many of which, and the majority of which are often women in these stories, but also then the empathy or the need to understand the perpetrator. And I've had so many women say to me, I don't want to be the victim of the next Ted Bundy. Help me to understand it. Help me to give me clues of what to look for. How can I identify a psychopath? How can I identify a sociopath? And so I find that many women are drawn to my shows for an educational reason and for safety and security. So I think that is at play here as well. And I think it goes even deeper psychologically in that someone like a Jeffrey Dahmer or a Ted Bundy even get us to look at ourselves, our own dark inner instincts, and get us to question what might I be capable of? Could I ever do something like that? You might hear someone say at work, I can't stand my boss. He's a jerk. Man, I'd love to kill that guy. But we don't do it. We don't do it, the vast majority of us. But these people do. They do. They kill complete strangers. So it gets us to kind of look in the mirror, even at ourselves, the dark side of ourselves, to say, what might I be capable of under duress, under dire circumstances? So I think it's multifaceted, the interest with these diabolical characters.
But it's also not like studying elephants, right? Like you with serial killers, I wouldn't say from my experience anyway, observing them and learning about them over the years, I've not found, and this is why you're a doctor and I'm not, I've not found one particular trait that they all seem to have, right? I mean, or is there?
Well, that is a great question. And I address this in my show. And there is a great myth out there that they're all sort of the same. They're all motivated by the same thing. They're all these sort of dysfunctional young men like the Tooth Fairy or Buffalo Bill in the Hannibal Lecter movies. And it's just not the case. They're very diverse. They come in every race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, IQ, socioeconomic status across the board. But to answer your question, they do have one common characteristic. And that common characteristic or common denominator is the fact that for these individuals, killing complete strangers serves some underlying, insatiable psychological need that is borne out through their lives in fantasy and over time becomes a hunger until it reaches a tipping point. And oftentimes it takes 10, 15, sometimes 20 years for this to happen, where they reach a tipping point where they can no longer just fantasize about killing. They actually have to do it. So there is a common factor. And serial killers don't kill because of the reason that most murders happen. Most homicides are actually not premeditated murders. They are
reactionary.
Reactionary or manslaughter really fall in the realm of manslaughter. They're not first degree premeditated murders. They're not even second degree murders where the intent to kill. Most murders tend to be even accidents where a couple of people get into a fight, one gets angry, punches the other one falls down, hits their head, and dies. So manslaughters are actually the most common type. Serial killers, therefore, are a complete aberration because there is the desire and the premeditation and the deliberation to kill. But taking it even a step further, most homicides result from anger, from something that triggers anger and homicide as a result. In the case of serial killers, there's no anger involved. These
Right.
are emotionless murders. They're based upon, once again, a hunger to kill. So serial killers are truly an aberration in every way from the average murder, if you will, in the United States.
Yeah, they're 9 times out of 10, they're setting out to go and kill. They're hunting essentially.
Yes,
And
they may not have a specific target in mind, although some of them do. Some of them have a specific target, like Dennis Rader, who called himself Bind, Torture, Kill. I'm very, very familiar with Dennis Rader, studied him, interviewed him, and he would have a specific target in mind that he had been watching and preparing for. Others have an intent to kill, but they don't have a specific target. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, for example, in California, he would literally go into a neighborhood that he didn't know at night and find an open window, climb inside, and kill whoever and whatever he found inside. He had the intent to kill, but he didn't even know who or what he would be killing.
yeah, Ramirez was looking for a house and an easy opportunity.
That's
And
good. Yes.
Raider, I think he called them what, PJs?
Projects.
I think he would refer to them as PJs, as projects.
Yeah.
The thing that I've found, I see time and time again, even if it's not obvious at the crime scene or obvious with the victim, to me it appears that there's always some kind of sexual nature to, or they're sexually driven, most serial killers.
Well, the ones that we are most familiar with, the BTKs, since we're talking about him, or the John Wayne Gacy's, there's a sexual aspect to many of these, but in fact, it's hard to get definitive numbers on this kind of stuff because there's not even really the true database of serial murder per se. I would say it's about 50 to 60% have a sexual component. There are others where there's just absolutely no sexual component at all. For example, you have individuals who are mission killers, and they may say, I have decided I'm giving myself the mission to rid the world of homeless individuals, homeless men. And there's no sexual component there at all. They've simply, their fantasy, going back to the fantasy need once again, is that they must rid the world of these particular individuals. You also have comfort. They're called comfort or gain killers. And many times female serial killers will fall into this category. And they will kill for purposes of, for example, extorting individuals, or the landlady killers who will take in people, milk them of their social security, and then kill them and bury them in the backyard, like Dorothy Puente out in California. So no, it's not all sexual in nature, but I would say yes, probably about half. Half has either a specific sexual motive like Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a hedonist lust killer. That's the category he fell into, and he truly obsessed sexually for these men that he killed, and he actually believed that he was in love with them. He was deluded, in his delusions. He truly loved them. The sexual component can be direct and overt like that, or it can be secondary. In the case of BTK, his primary objective or motive was really power, domination, and control, the extermination of others. But then after the fact, post-mortem, he would masturbate on their bodies. So there was a sexual component, but it wasn't really the driving force behind his murders.
And he would sexually relive those crimes over and over again. He talked about going in this bizarre hobby of going and staying in a hotel, right, overnight, so he could live out in a one-man show, live out his fantasies and fantasize about all this stuff.
Yeah.
Before and after. But then I guess the thing is, though, we talk about that they live in fantasy, and it's a characteristic that they share is living out this fantasy. But I wouldn't think that a greed motivated serial killer is living out a fantasy, right? Like if you're taking in the elderly and you're killing them to collect their social security checks, I can't imagine that they're fantasizing about that for an extended period of time or any time at all.
They are. When you say fantasy, we oftentimes we think of like a sexual fantasy, but it's not played out that way. This
Right.
is their compulsion. They're compelled to do it, and they do dream about it, and they do think about it, and they are obsessed with it. That the fantasy can even just be it's an obsession, but it's something that compels them that they absolutely must do, and they generally speaking have no control over it. It reaches this tipping point where they simply must act out on it. And again, it varies by individual, and it varies by the nature of this fantasy or compulsion, but it is something that they have in common. That the thing that drives them to kill is as I said, is very different than what is in a normal case of homicide. So Dorothea Puente, for example, yes, she did obsess and dream and think about how to get the next victim, how to bring them in, how to manipulate them and coerce them into bringing them into her lair, if you will.
I'm guessing that you're familiar with Roy Hazelwood's work.
Roy Hazelwood, in fact, was a very good friend of mine.
Oh,
Sadly,
wow.
yeah, sadly he passed away a few years ago.
Yeah.
But he was a very good friend of mine. The way that I go about profiling myself is very much drawn from his dichotomy of the organized versus disorganized killer.
Yeah. And so I guess when I think of serial killers and think of fantasy, I'm thinking of how Roy Hazelwood described it. And I loved the way that he described it of, okay, you have this guy, this sick, perverse guy has this fantasy. And at some point he's the director. He's written the script. He's the director. And now he just needs somebody to play the role of the victim. And so when I think of fantasy, I guess I'm equating it to the way that Hazelwood described it, I think in Dark Dreams. But yeah, no, that's interesting to hear about the greed motivated serial killers and that they're compelled to do it. Speaking of compelled to do it, of course, everybody's familiar with John Wayne Gacy, but I don't know how much you've studied him in particular.
Quite a bit. I'm pretty familiar with Gacy.
So one thing that I saw, I think it was I can't remember the gentleman's name. One of his defense attorneys wrote a book decades after the case, and years after Gacy was executed. But he describes in his book a situation where he's in a confined space with Gacy. He said that at some point Gacy almost went into like this zombie-like state, and he had said that he thought that is what Gacy, the similar state that he would have been in during the course of committing some of these homicides. And one thing that I found very strange, there was another gentleman who's no longer with us. I can't remember his name either. Forgive me. A book called I think it was called The Last Victim. He traded letters with Gacy and went to visit him in prison. And he described a very similar thing with Gacy many years later, obviously, where he said Gacy tried to grab him and attack him during the course of their visit. And he said the same thing where Gacy's face almost changed. It contorted and he went into like this zombie, like almost Frankensteinish kind of state. And Gacy said that he doesn't remember the killings, which I don't believe, but I tend to think everybody's guilty and more guilty than they will ever admit. But in your work and your research, have you found any of that? Do you believe any of that to be true?
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, Gacy was a pathological liar. You have to take a lot of what he said with, a grain.
Almost all of them are, right? Like,
yeah, well, many of them. Yeah, many of them. They not all, but yes, many of them are pathological liars. But in terms of this, like flipping a switch, and almost becoming a different person, yeah, I am very much aware of that phenomenon, and have had many people describe it to me in encounters with these individuals. And one that I think it bears mentioning because it's so profound is back to Dennis Rader once again. His daughter, I don't know if you know Carrie Rawson. She wrote the book Serial Killer's Daughter, which became a bestseller. She was in her 30s when she found out that her father was, one of the most diabolical killers of the 20th century, and you can imagine the psychological implications of that, and how it troubled her. Well, when her father was arrested in 2004, she cut off all communication with him.
Mm-hmm.
She had not spoken to him until very recently because there are cold cases that they're attempting to connect to Rader, and so she got back involved, and at the request of police, and actually agreed to go and sit with her father to see if she could get any information about these cold cases. Well, so Carrie, throughout her life, had believed that this man was, a loving father, and had no reason to believe that there was anything strange about him. And yet, when she went to see him this time, she said she saw him transform into BTK for the first time. When she started to question him about these potential cold cases, she said his eyes blackened and hardened, and he became someone different right in front of her. So that's very much what you're describing.
Do you prefer studying somebody like a BTK who's able to articulate some of the stuff behind the mask for us? You know what I mean? Like I think John Douglas said that Ed Kemper was always one of the most interesting to him because he was one of the few that could really offer true insight uh,
Yeah, yeah, I
because of
think.
his intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think Dahmer was very interesting for that reason, because it almost seemed like he was trying to do some introspection, and I don't know whether you want to call it soul searching, but in the during incarceration, he seemed to try to understand himself. And BTK, or Rader, definitely, well, of course he loves to talk about himself because he thinks he's the most interesting guy he knows,
Yeah.
but he really tried to understand, and he told me he wanted to understand this compulsion that led him to kill, but he really couldn't understand it. And that's why he came up with the term Factor X. You probably heard that term, Factor X, which is what he calls his own compulsion to kill. And I had many conversations with Roy Hazelwood about BTK. He told me that he thought that Rader was in fact the most stone cold psychopath that he ever encountered, and he interviewed many, if not most of them. And Rader, you mentioned his use of autoerotic fantasy, where he would relive his killings, and he actually kept a trophy chest in the house buried, he called it the mother lode of trophies. And when he felt that itch rising up to kill, he would dress up dolls, as you said, and then vividly reenact his killings, including bondage and fetishism and strangulation, then of course masturbation. And the incredible thing or even more incredible than the act itself, was why he did it. He tried to control his own compulsion to kill because he didn't want to be controlled by it. So it's the ultimate irony. He's the control freak playing God, and he would not allow himself to be controlled by his own compulsions to kill. Therefore, he used this autoerotic fantasy as a way to try to keep it under control, which I just find so fascinating and disturbing. But at the same time, it's because he's willing to be so introspective that I was able to unearth, this explanation.
I think he also referred to it as cubism, right? Where when he would be Dennis Rader and hide Factor X, and then when he would allow Factor X to come out and take over.
Yeah, well, it's in psychological terms, we call it compartmentalization,
Mm-hmm.
but he had his own word for it. You're right, cubing, and so that's what allowed him to not have any sort of cognitive dissonance, or even acknowledge any kind of contradiction or irony. You say, well, how can you be this killer and torturer, and also be the loving father on one hand, and the church leader, the president of your Lutheran Church Association and Boy Scout leader on the other. And he would simply say they're just three different things. Those are three different things. There's no crossover. So when he's in BTK room, he is not in daddy room or in a Lutheran church room. So to him, there is no contradiction, which of course allows him to sleep like a baby at night because he doesn't see any contradictions there.
I don't know if Roy Hazelwood was a part of this or not. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But one thing that I thought was fascinating when reviewing BTK, it was John Douglas that said that when he was still at large, right? Like we're going back many years now, but when they were still hunting BTK, he said the profilers sat down and tried to round table discussion a profile of BTK. And he said anytime they attempted to do it, the room would always end up in an argument because they could never agree on a profile for somebody like Dennis Rader.
Yeah, I do remember Roy talking about that, and that's one of the reasons. He even among serial killers, Rader kind of stands out as a bit unique for a number of reasons, and one is that trying to control his own compulsion to kill and the autoerotic fantasy, but another is that the tremendously long period that would transpire in between his murders. Typically it might be weeks or months, but in the case of Rader, it was years. And that's just almost unprecedented. If anything, it tends to be the opposite. They tend to escalate. Like Bundy escalated over time, whereas Rader did the opposite. And so again, that's another one of the reasons why he's just he's rather interesting in terms of the ilk, the category there of serial killers.
And the thing too that strikes me as unique about Dennis Rader, Rex Harriman, those two in particular, I have a hard time thinking of other serial killers that didn't just completely spiral out of control, right? Like where Bundy started off very organized, he eventually turns into like this almost frenzy killer. And you look at, and usually that's their downfall. And when I say downfall, meaning leading to their capture. Dahmer did it. Even Ed Kemper, who might have the highest IQ out of all of the serial killers that I can think of, even he turned into a frenzy killer. I've always equated it to like a drug with like Bundy in particular, Dahmer, Kemper, that it's a drug, and you once you start chasing that dragon, it gets harder and harder to catch, and you need more, and just like heroin, you need more and more and more to get you there, and you're always trying to get as close to the edge without going over. Why do you think that somebody like a Raider or the Long Island serial killer, why do you think that do you think on a long enough timeline they would eventually become frenzy killers, or do you think that it's just they were able to avoid that somehow?
I'm very familiar with the Long Island serial killer, Huerman. In fact, I profiled him back in 2011, and there's an interesting story that I'll tell you about there. But we don't know. In the case of Huerman, I think there are many, many other bodies out there that we simply don't even know about yet. In the case of Rader, again, power and control. Everything was about power and control. And so he was attempting even to control himself. He's a control freak, which is what makes him a bit different. And of course, as he got older, it's interesting, Rader tended to pick victims who weren't quite as young, youthful, and vigorous. He tended to go for older women as time went on. So it's almost like he was aware of his own mortality or limitations to a certain extent. But it is one of the things that makes him stand out because, as you said, many of them do escalate. And I think your your use of the drug addiction analogy is very apt, because I had David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, explain to me with each murder. Now, his fantasy is that he thought he was serving Satan. He believed that he was killing at the behest of his master, Satan. And but each time he went out there, he was hoping that this particular killing would live up to his fantasies that he had beforehand, but it never did. And so he would be compelled to do it again and again and again. So it is very much like you said, chasing that dragon, chasing that narcotic high. However, interestingly, when I wrote about this and Berkowitz found out that I used the drug addiction analogy to describe him, he didn't like it at all. He seemed to prefer the devil made me do it because to him it made him sound more like he couldn't control it, like it was beyond his control. Whereas the drug analogy made him feel weak or that he was responsible, and he didn't like that very much. So as much as I believe the drug addiction analogy is very useful, Son of Sam didn't like it very much.
Yeah, it makes it easier for him to rationalize his own actions if he wasn't in control, right?
Exactly. The devil made me do it. Yeah.
Yeah. And he's certainly a whole different specimen. Let's go back to Rex. A lot of people would agree with you that there's some bodies out there.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Give us a little more thought, a little more detailed thought on Rex.
Yeah, sure.
And
Okay.
potential other victims. There's some speculation. I think he and maybe a brother owned a property out of state together or something of that nature.
He owned property at different times in Las Vegas as well as in South Carolina, and I've been very involved with this. So let me take you back a little bit. This all started was December of 2010 when the so-called Gilgo Four were discovered there in that remote area on the south shore of Long Island. 4 young female bodies. And it was quickly determined that they were missing sex workers. And it was also quickly determined that there was a serial killer. They were all killed by the same hand because 3 of them were wrapped in matching camouflage burlap, and the 4th was bound in a belt, and they were all arranged together there. And at that time, I was teaching just outside of Manhattan, New York at Drew University, and I was doing my own research into serial killers and interviewing the likes of Son of Sam and BTK. And so I wasn't surprised when a couple of months later, when an additional 7 bodies were discovered nearby there in Gilgo Beach, that the New York Times newspaper reached out to me and they asked me to put together an extensive psychological and behavioral profile of this unknown killer. And I predicted at that time that we would be looking at a middle-aged white male, family man, father of a couple of adult children, and that he would be professional, highly educated, highly meticulous, very persuasive, able to manipulate and control these young women. I even predicted that he would be a gun collector and a hunter, but also a sadist, and that he would live right there in the neighborhood of his sacred burial ground, as I was calling it, on Gilgo Beach. And here's where it gets back to a couple of individuals that we've been talking about. Because I went to Roy Hazelwood, and I said, Roy, look at the profile I put together. What do you think? And he said, I think you're dead on. He said, I think we're dealing with a sexual sadist, an insatiable killer, a narcissist, and very much like BTK. And I said, well, thank you, Roy, because that's exactly what I'm thinking. And in fact, I'm corresponding right now with Rader, so I'm going to run this by him as well. And being the complete narcissist and psychopath that Rader is, he was more than happy to play my game. And so I was sort of his Clarice Starling to his Hannibal Lecter. And I said, teach me, oh, wise one. Mm-hmm. And Rader said to me, he said, this man that you're looking for will absolutely be a clone. He is going to be a copycat. And he meant a clone of himself, a sexual sadist, very much like himself, which is exactly what I thought. And so I went ahead, published my profile. But then as we know, the years went by and it became somewhat cold, this case, over time, or at least on the surface. And there were even allegations of corruption there in the police department on Long Island. But lo and behold, when the new regime came in last summer, all of a sudden, one day, my phone just blew up and my computer. And I was being contacted by journalists all over the United States and all over the world saying, have you heard Rex Heuermann has been arrested for these murders and your profile was 100% accurate? And well, I was, obviously gratified to hear that, but mostly I was happy that someone had been apprehended. And the more I got into it, the more I learned, the more I realized that my profile really had penetrated his psyche because, he was the white middle-aged guy with, children living openly in plain sight. But he's an architect in terms of precision education. He was trained in engineering, mathematics, and design. And he was his own salesman because he had his own architectural firm. He was selling his own ideas, so highly persuasive and articulate. And recently, I don't know if you're aware of this, just a couple of weeks ago, they unearthed his blueprints for murder. They found in his house these blueprints for murder. So not only was he doing blueprints for buildings, architecture, but blueprints for murder. So he was this incredibly precise, detail-oriented individual that I predicted, and he was a gun collector and a big game hunter. He hunted bear and would skin them, after the fact. And probably the biggest thing of all is he lived literally in viewing distance of the beach of the burial ground, and I have no doubt he went back there to fantasize and relive, and I have no doubt that there are additional bodies. I'm sure he did not stop killing. People ask me all the time, do you think he stopped killing in 2010 when his burial ground was discovered? And absolutely not. He's just been charged with 2 more murders just a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, I have a feeling that there are burial grounds out there that have not even been discovered yet.
Do you think he killed the Asian male, the baby doe, Jane Doe number 3, who's often
That's
referred to as
that's a
Peaches?
great question. You could make a case. You could make a case where he picked up a sex worker and it ended up being a sex worker in drag. And that one was killed differently because the male had his head bashed in. So you could potentially see where Heuermann could have gotten angry if he didn't realize he picked up a sex worker in drag and bashed their head in. That's a possibility. In terms of the baby, I've said this before. There's no sex worker daycare out there, and it's not uncommon for sex workers to have their children in a nearby room or in the car or something like that while they're doing their work. So yeah, I can definitely envision scenarios where he could be responsible for potentially all those bodies.
With those, and if he is in fact responsible for those, it appears that it's just an evidence situation where we just don't have the evidence to.
Yeah, well, there were partial remains of 2 bodies in Manorville and then right there in Gilgo Beach, and those 2 have Jessica Taylor and I forget the other one's name have now been linked. He's been charged. He's been charged with the murders. So already they've linked some of those.
Well, and that's interesting. So not just on the to kind of bookend his serial killing career, if we want to call it that. On the one side, you have the question: did he continue to kill after 2010? You say yes. I think many would agree with you on that. But I believe that the average age when these guys typically start killing is what, mid 20s, early to mid 20s.
Yeah. The 20 normally at some point during the 20s, whether it's 20 years old or in the case of BTK, he was 28, so he was kind of like a late bloomer, if you will. But
Rex would be approximately 60 years of age. So,
mm-hmm.
And you referenced Jessica Taylor, who I believe she disappeared in 2003.
Mm.
He would have still been on the older side then. So how early do you think he started?
Oh, I think the early 90s. One of the victims that he's been linked to did disappear in the early 90s. So I think he's been active at least since say 91, 92.
Going undetected like this. I I have a hard time believing that he was only killing when his wife happened to be out of state.
Agreed. Totally agreed. In fact, he traveled. He was a hunter and he traveled. So it's not inconceivable that there are bodies out there that that he was responsible for on his hunting trips that haven't even been linked to him yet. And I really believe that when all is said and done, he's awaiting trial now, and there are all these open investigations in Las Vegas, in South Carolina. He's potentially linked to so many different cold cases that he may one day actually rival Joel Rifkin in New York as the most prolific serial killer in the state of New York history. Joel Rifkin had 17 victims, and it's not it's not unlikely that one day Huerman may actually rival that.
And aside from the shame that Rader brought to his I don't know, I don't want to get into a whole long discussion on do these individuals, are they even capable of love? I think that Rader thinks that he is, but it would be a much different love than you and I possess. I think Rader thinks that he can do that, because I think he said in his book with was it Kathleen Ramsland? He had expressed that was the only major fear that he had for getting caught was his wife and kids. And so Rex would fall into that same category. And if he truly is like Rader thinks he would be, a clone of Rader to me, if he didn't have a wife and kids, seems like he was just itching to brag about all of this stuff. And now that he's been detected, caught, apprehended, and living behind bars, it seems like no shortage of people that he's willing to talk with.
Well, agreed. He needs a grandstand from which to preach from, and which is why even when he was killing, he was engaging in his terror campaign, where he was sending letters to the news media and law enforcement, and playing this game of catch me if you can, even giving them clues and sending them poems and ciphers and all kinds of stuff, because that was just part of the game. It just made it more exciting for him, and especially that he could show, look. I'm the puppet master here. You have no idea who I am, and I'm playing with you. And it just gave him that excitement. Well, once that was taken away and he was unmasked and taken into custody, well, he just stepped onto a different stage. Now I'm going to horrify you. I'm going to make you relive these murders. I'm going to make the victims relive the murders. And I'm going to tell you just how great I think I am and what fools you are, because it took you 30 years to catch me. So yeah, he needs that pulpit, if you will, and he'll find it any way he can. And so now, this irony didn't escape me as I was corresponding with him, and as I'm sure as Kathleen Ramsland also was corresponding with him, she was aware of the fact that we're feeding his ego. We're giving him what he wants. We're giving him attention, but at the same time, valuable things can be learned from the interactions with an individual like this. But he's so grandiose. He told me, he said people must study me. The world must comprehend me. He's so incredibly grandiose and full of himself.
Yeah, he certainly has a strong opinion of himself. But with Rex, with how they, in BTK's words, a clone of Dennis Rader, I really thought we would see a similar thing where once he's picked up, he'll just start, the floodgates will open up and he'll just start talking to police. But clearly that's not happened. I don't think that maybe his defense team is the only people on this planet that think that there is a defense and that we live in a world where he doesn't get convicted. But once he's convicted of several of these murders and the appeals start to run out, do you think that do you think that Rex will just start telling us, okay, this is what I've done. Here's my victims. Here's where they are. Here's because we talk about compulsion. He had that compulsion to taunt the family members of the victims, right? He couldn't stop himself from calling them.
That's right. That's right. Well,
So he does want to talk. He does want an audience, I
yes,
think.
yes. He's cut out very much the same cloth as BTK. I think he has similar, grandiosity and attention needs and control. Definitely, he's what's known as a power and control killer, very much like BTK. It's not about the sex per se. It's about the domination, control, extermination of human life. I mean, BTK told me in no uncertain terms, when he kills, he is God. It's not that he wants to be God. It's not that he tries to be God or he thinks he might be. He is God in his own mind, and you can't really get more, of a power and control freak than that. But to answer your question, I think Huerman is holding that card back. He is a power and control freak too, and I think he is going to do whatever gives him that gratification that his ego needs. And right now he's holding it back. He's saying, oh, no, no, I didn't do this. He may be thinking down the line, there's cases out there that they don't know about. There may be an opportunity for me to bargain here, the way the Green River killer and Bundy did about other cases. So I think he's holding that card back. Is it possible down the road where he plays out his hand and there's nothing left except to step on the grandstand and like BTK has done and say, look at me, look what I did. I killed 25 people. Well, hopefully not, but and brag about it. I could definitely foresee that down the road, but I think that's a card he's holding back at this point.
Out of all the serial killers that you've studied, who is the one that either you're intrigued the most by, or is a complete mystery to you even after you've spent time studying them? Maybe it's somebody that we're the masses are not so well aware of. Who is that for you?
Great, really good question. And I would have to say Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. And the reason is he's such, it's hard to pin him down in terms of exactly what his motivations were. Really, he falls into a category that's known as a thrill killer. And the Zodiac would be another one that would fit in this category, as well as Israel Keys up in Alaska. These are individuals that it's not about the killing. It's not the act of killing. It's the excitement that the killing and leading up to the killing and the process of it, almost like a big game hunter, that it provides them. And for Richard Ramirez, even murder was not enough. We touched on this earlier. He would go into a house in the dark, climb in the window. He had no idea what was going to be inside. There could be 10 Dobermans inside. There could be 10 people with guns. He had no idea. Well, that just upped the ante for him. It just upped the thrill. And once he was inside, he would then improvise and decide what to do, because he was happy to rob, he was happy to rape, he was happy to do whatever might give him satisfaction. So, for example, he would improvise, and this is, it's a horrible thing to talk about, but let's say he finds a married couple inside. He might decide on a whim to tie the man up in a chair and force the husband to watch as he repeatedly raped and tortured the wife. And then when he was satisfied with that, he would then kill her in front of the man and then kill the man. So it's just so incomprehensible that even he didn't know what he was going to do. He would improvise on the spot. And that kind of mind, that kind of twisted thinking and need is just, it's just so almost incomprehensible. And even the fact, taking it a step further, is, again, even for his own safety, he didn't know what he was going to find. Whereas people like Bundy and John Wayne Gacy and Rader were meticulous planners. They wanted to be in control of every detail. They wanted to be the master of the moment. Whereas in the case of Ramirez, it was completely the opposite. He wanted to up the ante and make it riskier for himself. So it's just so hard to wrap your mind around.
Yes, so little control. I mean, he was smoking crack. I mean,
yeah. Oh yeah, he was very unusual. I'm so glad you mentioned that. Serial killers typically are not substance abusers. Now,
right.
Dahmer was an alcoholic, so that that was an exception there. But typically, the high is the killing, and they don't need the drugs and the alcohol. But you're right, Ramirez, on top of everything else, he was also an alcoholic and a drug addict.
I don't want to get into something that's impossible to answer, but you're an expert, so I'll throw it out there since we're talking about Ramirez. One thing that's always like stuck in the back of my mind with him is when he talked about his older cousin.
Mm.
And I think the cousin spent some time in Vietnam. And how much do you think if he never had that relationship, does he still turn into the monster that he ended up?
Yes, you're talking about where he came back from Vietnam, and he was showing him photos of terrible things that they did to the Vietnamese women,
Yep.
and Ramirez became sexually aroused, and yeah, if that hadn't awoken the monster inside of him, something else would have. Raider had a somewhat similar evolution when he was about 10. I don't know if you know this story. When he was about 10, he was visiting his grandmother's farm, and he witnessed her killing a chicken. She was going to cook it for dinner, and as she chopped the head off the chicken and the blood squirted out, he became sexually aroused. Raider, we're talking about. So many of these individuals have some sort of an experience like that sort of awakens something in them. And what happened, and this happened for Bundy, it had that I'm aware of. It happened for Dahmer, BTK, Ramirez, where somewhere around adolescence, sexual pleasure, and sadism and dismemberment and blood and torture somehow became all intertwined, and it became sexually arousing to them. It's not. I don't think it's an absolutely necessary component to the evolution of a serial killer, but it definitely is a trait that you see. So something awakens this in them, and the majority of these individuals are psychopaths, meaning that they are essentially unplugged emotionally from the world, can't feel the normal range of emotions, but they can feel excitement. They can feel physical pleasure and physical excitement. Oftentimes, that's what compels them and drives them.
They're also very visual. That like many of and this just grosses me out beyond anything. And it gives me the shivers to even think about. But I've seen several of them reference that one of the things that drove them to do this again and again was the look of terror on their victim's face. BTK talked about getting sexually aroused at the fantasy of tying a woman up to the train tracks and watching her as she goes into a state of terror as the train gets closer and closer, and she can't do anything about it. And
Yes.
I think Jill Bear, or however we want to say his name, Juber, he's expressed that once he was in prison, saying that it was the look on the boy's face when he was doing horrible things to him. And I think Joseph Duncan said something like that as well. For Rex, I always thought, even before they caught him, I always thought that there was something to his perversion of the look on the face of the sex worker when they realize he tricked them.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I absolutely think that that's the case. I think it was true for Joel Rifkin, and who also preyed on runaways and sex workers, BTK, Bundy. Absolutely, it gets to that power and control again. It's the shock. It's like they when the victim realizes, oh my God, I've been taken in, and this is it. My life is over. And I think that definitely escalates the fantasy. And I wanted to comment on something you said earlier, in your conversations about Roy Hazelwood, when you were saying that, it's almost like they're like a director of a movie. And I think where Roy may have gotten that is BTK, because I asked him when he killed, and I guess for your audience's purposes, BTK's first murder was actually a mass murder of four members of a home, the Oteros, Latino family, and terribly he saved the 11-year-old girl for last, made her watch as he killed the other members of her family, and then he took her in the basement and and hanged her from the ceiling rafters in the basement, just let her dangle there and die, and watched her, sat in a chair right across from her, eye to eye, and watched her die. And as unimaginable or as incomprehensible as it might seem, and I asked him, I said, why did you do that? And he said exactly that. He says, I was a movie director. He said, I'm like Martin Scorsese or Steven Spielberg. And I envisioned that scene. I directed it in my mind 1,000 times with Josephine, and specifically Josephine, because he had been watching her. And he said, when she died, when I watched the light of life extinguish in her eyes in that movie scene, I knew that I was God. And again, that gets to the just incredible nature of power and control pathology that he had. But he definitely used and would repeatedly use that movie director analogy. And he said that his fantasy mind was so vivid, it was better than any Technicolor movie. His fantasies.
The whole basement thing with him too, because he would talk about, even as an adult, going to his parents' house and masturbating in the basement.
Yeah.
Just really weird stuff with him, and of course weird stuff with all of them. The visual thing. Here's something I never even thought about until just this moment. But has there ever been a blind serial killer?
A blind serial killer. That's interesting. No one comes to my mind.
Me neither.
Yeah, but that would be pretty hard to pull off. I think that would be rather difficult to pull off. Nothing comes to mind. But in terms of the visual, many of them love to draw.
Yeah.
I mean, John Wayne Gacy, of course, being the king there. With his pogo paintings, the clown paintings, and so forth. Rader loved to sketch. Ramirez would sketch. Of course, Huerman, being an architect, he's a very skillful artist. So it's interesting, the visual aspect of it, and then also visually, pornography being a stimulant. So many of them talked about how pornography was part of their early evolution into this. That they would look at pornography and then fantasize about death and murder and things like that.
A conversation I've had, found myself in several times, in recently in the last couple years anyway. You know, in my neck of the woods, I'm looked at as somewhat of an expert on these things. So when people have questions, they true crime or serial killer, they usually bring them to me. And the one that I get a lot, or at least one that sticks out, is, "Hey Nick, why are we seeing less serial killers these days than in the 70s, 80s, maybe even in the 90s?" And one of my quick answers is that I think that it's not for it's not for a shortage of these types. It's more that I think in a lot of cases we're catching these guys after victim number one.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Yes.
that true? Do we think we have less serial killers today in the last 5-10 years than we did from what we saw in the 70s and the 80s?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is a question I'm asked all the time, and based upon the pop culture depiction of these individuals and how prevalent they are in our entertainment media and in our news media, there is this erroneous opinion among so many people that they're far more prevalent than they really are. And in fact, no more than 1% to 2% of all homicides that occur in the United States every year are attributable to serial killers. And there's currently about 20,000 homicides a year in the U.S. The number is actually going down, contrary to a lot of news media statements to the opposite, but it is going down. But it's about what are we looking at? We're looking at 200 to 400 at the most of those being serial killer victims. Now, if you go back to the 70s and 80s, which are often considered the heyday, if you will, of serial killers, when the Bundys and the BTKs were out doing their thing, and the John Wayne Gacy's, in the 1960s, it's been documented that there were at least 650 serial killers active during the 1970s. That number escalated to 800 or more by the 1980s. But then by the 1990s, the number started to drop off, and it's been dropping off steadily ever since. Currently, in the 2020s, the decade we're in right now, there have been documented somewhere between, let's say, 2 to 3 dozen. So you can see how far down the numbers have gone. And I would totally agree with you. It's not that this pathology, this need, the twisted combination of nature and nurture that leads people to become serial killers. I don't believe that's left humanity. I wish it had, but I don't think it has.
Right.
I think what's happened is that first and foremost, our friends like Roy Hazelwood and John Douglas and Bob Ressler and some of the others, thanks to them in the 1970s, they developed these new techniques for identification, profiling, and ultimately apprehension. And when you develop good tools that work, you find a lot of what you're looking for. Up until the 1970s, it was very difficult for them to even link crime scenes. They didn't even know they had serial killers. And suddenly now, they were better able to do it. And then what happened is they got a lot better at apprehension with better policing techniques. And of course, the big changer there came in the form of science, DNA, in 1986 when DNA was first used. And now you've got the ultimate game changer, because now you can link someone to a crime scene where there is never any other physical evidence available. And many of these individuals, like BTK, left their DNA readily at crime scenes, like his semen after he would masturbate, never thinking that it could ever be linked to him. And so now people like the Golden State Killer, BTK, the Long Island serial killer, as he was matched through DNA, hair and on the victims. These individuals are being apprehended. Many of them cold cases that had been open for decades. I'll take it a step further. I think that that all of the true crime programming and podcasts like this one, that we're right now, that people love, it served an educational purpose, and people are just not as cavalier as they were in the 60s and 70s. People don't leave their doors open. They don't invite strangers in, and God forbid, go hitchhiking across the country with John Wayne Gacy or Ted Bundy. We're just a much more vigilant society. So when you put all these factors together, I think it's just much more difficult now to be a successful, prolific serial killer than it was back in the 70s and before. And I do believe, I think you're right on the money. I think that fledgling wannabe serial killers are being apprehended after their first murder before they even reach serial killer status. And a likely candidate there, which is also ripped right out of the headlines, is Brian Kohberger, who's been charged with the mass murder of 4 students in Idaho. I've looked at his background. I've looked at his evolution, his profile. It's very similar to Bundy and BTK and even Huerman. And I think had he not been apprehended, foolishly, stupidly, a rookie error, he left a knife sheath there with touch DNA on it. If he
Thankfully,
yeah. If he hadn't been apprehended, I think there's an excellent chance he would have gone on to become a serial killer.
Talking about the 70s and the 80s, the golden era, if you want to call it, for just the sheer number of serial killers at the time. And I'm probably going to butcher his name, but I think it was Peter Vronsky, who, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but
he's another friend of mine. Peter's a friend of mine.
I need to get in your circle somehow. Everybody I'm reading, you've been chums with, but I think he said that he cited Vietnam as a pretty major factor for, and if I'm speaking out of, if I'm getting this incorrect, feel free to cut me off. But I think he cited something like the Vietnam War, for maybe driving those numbers up, because it's a situation where men go off to war, fathers go off to war, some of them don't come back, and we've certainly seen a direct correlation between parents and serial killers. And some of the fathers don't come back, but some of the ones that do come back, they're all messed up, and then they mess up their kid.
Yeah, well, that gets back to the nature versus nurture debate. Are they nature? Are they born that way? Nurture? Are they environmentally conditioned or socialized into it? I think Peter's absolutely right. I think there's a number of societal factors that can contribute to that, and sometimes even directly. There was I forget his name exactly, but this is a while back. There was a soldier, and this was during the Iraq War. He was trained to be a sniper, but when he got over to Iraq, he wasn't utilized that way. He was given a very mundane job, and he was so resentful of the fact that the government had trained him, spent all this money and trained him, and not utilized his skills, that when he came back to the United States, he decided that he was going to utilize those skills that had been not used properly, and he decided to rid Los Angeles of homeless men. So he became a sniper, and he started killing homeless men in Los Angeles. So there's as a direct result of the way he felt that he had been misused during the war.
Have you studied the I-70 killer? Because I feel like he's very, very, and I'm not talking about the truck driver one. I'm talking about the man that went into a few different businesses and in and out within minutes and kills somebody in the store. I find him to be incredibly distinctly different than most of the serial killers that I'm familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not as familiar. I mean, I know the case, but I'm not familiar with a lot of the details of it. I know what you're saying. I know that there's a bit of it seems to be a bit of an aberration.
He's one that I've always really wanted to see a proper profile put together on him, but I don't know that his crimes lend themselves to a profile. You've done profiles. What would prevent you from being able to put together a profile on a particular serial killer?
Well, tip of the hat to our friend Roy Hazelwood here. I'm a big proponent of the belief that the crime scenes tell the story. You can derive so much information psychologically and from a behavioral standpoint from the crime scene that they leave, and particularly the way that they dispose of the victim. So the more information that is available, the more evidence that's available at the crime scene, the more vivid your profile is going to be. And because Rex Heuermann, for example, was so meticulous and so organized in the way that he left his victims, and creating his own sacred burial ground the way it did, it gave me a plethora, if you will, of information to work from. So the less evidence, the less crime scene evidence you have, the more difficult it is to profile. And
you already referenced 4 Thomas Harris characters in our conversation. So that makes me, the crime scene information makes me think of Will Graham, Hannibal Lecter's nemesis, who would look at a crime scene and say, try to put himself in the mind of the killer saying, this is my design. Yeah, exactly. And that is very much what you do. And that's what I learned from Roy. Which is why he was such a visionary, such a genius. I mean, they all added their things, whether it's Douglas, John Douglas and Bob Ressler and others. Ressler's the one that's actually credited with using the term serial killer for the first time in the FBI. And that's actually, did you ever hear the story of how, where that came from? What came from?
The term serial killer and how Ressler used it the first time.
Yeah, because I think back in the day they called it mass murder, which is...
Yeah, they just lumped them together. They up until 1973, they just lumped them together with mass murderers, or what we today would look at as like a public shooter. So that... I live in Las Vegas, so the October 1st killer here would be lumped together with a Ted Bundy, and boy, oh boy, you cannot have 2 more different individuals than that. The motives and the rationale and the reasons are just completely opposite. But anyway, it's kind of an interesting little story. Is Ressler I think he was over in the UK, and he was lecturing at a university over there, and he was trying to explain how serial killers work. And he says it's almost like serial a serial entertainment. And he's thinking back to the times like in the 1940s and 1950s when kids on a Saturday afternoon would go to the theater and watch the adventures of Flash Gordon or Superman or something like that, and then would have to go back every Saturday to see the latest installment. They call them serials. So he said that these individuals are like serial killers. They just do it again and again and again, which I thought was kind of an interesting little anecdote.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's end on a light note here, something much more fun. I cannot avoid this. It cannot be ignored for one more second. And forgive me if you think that I'm an idiot, because most of the time I am. Dr. Scott Bonn, please tell me that your parents were huge AC/DC fans and named you somewhat after Bon Scott.
I wish I could say that that's the case, but no, it's a coincidence. But it's a coincidence that I like because I happen to be big AC/DC fans.
Brilliant conversation. Thanks so much for talking with me today. How can our listeners learn more about what you do? Do you have anything that you want to promote?
Yeah, I sure do. I'm currently touring the country with my one-man theatrical event, which is called Serial Killers with Dr. Scott Bonn. But if you want to find out where I'm going to be performing at a theater near you, you can go to my website, which is docbonn.com, and I'll spell that DOCBONN.com. And the whole tour schedule is there, along with the dates, cities, and links to purchase tickets. And I promise you an exciting, thrilling, and chilling evening where I'm going to share anecdotes from all my experiences with these individuals. We're going to go into their motivations, their desires, and I always do a live Q&A session with the audience where I take questions, and we always have a lot of fun with that because it always seems that people have that one question about serial killers that they've always been burning to ask, and so it proves to be a pretty fun evening.
Perfect. Hey, thanks so much for your time today, and let's do this again sometime.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.